Hi, this is Robert with Cruzbike, and today we're going to be going over the assembly of the 2021 Q45. This version of the Q45 has several exciting changes that we'll go over. I encourage you to take your time and follow any tips I might give in the video. The first step is to unpack and unwrap your bike, but I want to make a special note here for the wheels. We have moved to a through axle wheel on the Q45, but as you note, there are end caps on each side of the wheel. When you remove the protector, you need to make sure that you do not pull off the end cap and end up throwing it away. That end cap here, see, it comes off the axle, but it can also just come off when you pull the protector off and get stuck inside the protector. Make sure you check all of the protectors to ensure that you have not thrown away the end cap for your wheel, as this is a part that we do not have spares of. Just make sure the end cap is there on the end of the axle. You also want to make sure when you're assembling the bike and or just doing a tire change to keep that cap in place. Same thing for the front. Make sure when you peel the caps off, the protective caps, that you do not lose the end cap for the through axle hub. Very important for the rest of the assembly. After you have everything unpacked, we should take a quick inventory to make sure you have all the parts and nothing is lost in the packaging. You have your seat cushion. You'll also have your boom and slider and chainstay assembly pre-assembled here, and you'll have your seat back and seat pan. You'll have seat skewers, seat back, and you'll also have 3 different seat bases and a back seat mount. You will have a few hardware packages, a fender bracket, which is the small bracket there. You'll have your main frame and pedals. Note the rear skewer is already in the wheel. You'll also have your seat Velcro, reflectors, and rear derailleur. And of course the handlebar and wheels. And again, make sure on the wheels you have not misplaced the end caps for the hubs. The main frame has the seat tube installed and the kickstand installed already. And the front cables will be bound up there under the fork. You'll also have your front skewer, your threaded axle for your through axle, and your chain. And we're ready to begin assembly. Also want to locate your Cruzbike toolkit. I highly recommend protecting the frame and your floor with some materials out of the packaging. In order to make assembly much easier, I'm going to use the feedback wheel stand. It's also great for parking the bike. First thing we're going to do is unthread the rear threaded axle from the frame and go over a little bit of information here. The through axles have a fine thread. It's going to be very important to not cross thread these axles. I'm going to put a little grease on the threads here. Make sure everything's nice and greased up. Going to put the rear wheel in the stand. Certainly not necessary, but makes everything a little easier. And I'm going to position the main frame over the rear axle and just set it right down in the dropouts. Now, unlike a quick release wheel, a threaded axle wheel has to fit through the frame, through the hub, and thread into the other side. Now, unlike a quick release wheel, a through axle wheel rests on the axle itself, not in the dropout. Here we have the threaded nut on the other side. It is replaceable, but again, we want to use extreme caution not to cross thread the through axle. We're going to insert the through axle. You might have to raise the frame just a hair, again, because the wheel is resting on the axle, not on the dropout. Once we have the axle through, we're going to line up the other end going to be very careful to make sure that the threads engage properly and we do not cross thread it. It should be firm, but should thread smoothly. Can't emphasize enough the need to be very careful when installing a through axle wheel. It's also important to note here that the brakes are not completely nailed down yet. We'll have to do that later once we install the handlebars and the brake cables. Now for the front wheel, we will simply lift it up and insert the front wheel onto the fork dropouts. Because we've immobilized the rear wheel in the stand, this is a very easy process and will allow us to continue to work on the bike in an upright position. Next step is to locate our boom, slider, and chainstay assembly. And out of our Cruzbike toolkit, we're going to need a 4mm Allen, a 5mm Allen. We also need to locate our magnetic driver and the 5mm insert, as we're going to need two 5mm Allens for the next set. Here we have our front end located, ready to go. We're going to locate our front through axle. Again, I'm going to grease these threads a little bit. We're going to insert the chainstay over the fork. Note we have our dropout. It's threaded there. It's a derailleur hanger / threaded dropout. We're going to insert our through axle through the wheel. Again, we might have to lift the fork up a little bit, make sure everything's nice and smooth. Then on the other end, we're going to align everything up nice and straight, just like the rear wheel. Make sure it threads smoothly into the threaded portion of the chainstay. Very important not to cross thread this piece. Once we have everything nice and secure, the through axle will hold the front end in place. I suggest holding the front end up so the chainstay is at an angle that puts the bottom bracket roughly in line with the front of the wheel as shown here. As you can see, when we loosen the quick release for the through axle, we can move the front end, but we want to lock it down nice and secure for the next step. Now we want to take our 4mm Allen and we want to loosen the front two chainstay clamp bolts, just enough that we can move the front end. Once we have those loose, the front end will pivot, and we're just going to rest that there for now, get ready for the next step. With a 5mm Allen, we want to loosen the boom clamp on the front of the slider. Note, the part in my left hand is the slider, the part that houses the bottom bracket is the boom. Here we have the slider will come back and forth. This is also how we make fit adjustments, which we'll cover later. As you can see, once we have the through axle and those clamps just loose enough, we can move everything back and forth, which helps us for our fit. We can move the whole unit together, or we can move the front end independent of where the handlebars are located. For now, again, we're going to lock down that through axle, and we're going to remove the slider from the boom. I want to show you a little tip here. We have the pivot clamp and the boom clamp. The pivot clamp is the part that attaches to the fork. We're going to slide it back closer to the handlebars, and we're going to remove the slide shoulder bolt. And in our hardware package that you have, we're going to want to add a third washer. The slider bolt requires 3 washers. It comes with 2, but we need to add a third. So we want to have 2 of these washers on the shoulder side, just like this. And the third washer will go on the bolt side once we attach it. And they go on the outside of the pivot clamp. This is very important. the washers space out the shoulder part of the bolt and allow for proper clamping of the slider tube. So as you can see here, once we insert this on the bike, we want to make sure that those two washers are on the outside, on the shoulder end, and the third washer will be on the bolt end. And that'll allow for a proper clamping of the tube. All right, let's move on to the slider installation to complete our front end. We're going to insert the slider back onto the boom. We're going to check our alignment with the pivot clamp portion around the slider with the pivot clamp that's on the fork. It should line up nice and cleanly. If not, we have to make an adjustment. Everything here requires a straight alignment from the fork to the chainstay to the pivot clamp. If the angle of your pivot clamp on the fork is not parallel with the axle, as you can see here as an example, it's slightly turned to the left. We need this to be as straight as we can get it in line with the axle. If yours is turned and not aligned, let me go over the easy way to fix that. We're going to take our 5mm Allen. We're going to loosen the two bolts just enough that we can tweak that over to be in line. We're going to check our alignment here. We can also sight line down the front of the fork to make sure everything is aligned. Once it is, we're going to tighten those clamps back. Again, these do not have to be over tightened. Just tighten them back up to about the same level they were before. As you can see here, now we have a much better alignment of that front clamp with the axle. Very important that this alignment is correct and all these pieces line up nice and straight with one another. Now we're going to take our pivot clamp bolt. We're going to add a little bit of grease to it. I highly recommend adding some grease to this part. It will make everything a lot easier, especially in the future. And we're going to insert the cables under the clamp. Now these are the brake cables only. So the brake cables go under the clamp. Then we will insert our slider bolt through the clamp and insert the nut on the other side. And we're going to tighten it up just enough so that it doesn't slide around. We're not going to completely tighten it down just yet. We want to turn everything so it lines up. The handlebar clamp, everything should be level. I want to emphasize here the fact that all of these pieces require a real attention to the alignment. We want to make sure that everything is lined up and level. All the clamps are aligned with one another. That will make sure that the front end adjusts smoothly. It will also make sure there's no tension on the chainstay, which will make doing front wheel changes much easier in the future. Now, using our number 4 Allen, we're going to remove the handlebar clamps and bolts. I recommend putting a little bit of grease on the threads here. Again, always good to grease the threads. We're going to take our handlebars. The sweep goes towards the front. And we're going to install our clamps. Now, it's very important when we tighten these down that we do not over tighten the handlebar clamps. It's a very common mistake. People over tighten these and they break the clamps or break the slider threaded portion. When we tighten these handlebar clamps, we want to tighten them all evenly. We want to make sure that there's a gap on the top and the bottom and that gap is as even as we can get it. So once we get that nice and snug with a nice even gap, then we're ready to go. The same rule for the evenness applies to the chainstay clamps. These only ever need to be snug and then about 1/4 or so turn past snug with an even gap on the front and the back. Another common mistake is over tightening these two clamps, causing breakage. 1/4 turn pass snug is all we need for when we're actually complete with the setup. For now, we're going to leave them a little loose just so we can adjust the front end up and down. A good rule of thumb for an initial setup of your handlebars is to line up the angle of the grip with the angle of the steer tube, as you can see here. Once our handlebars are nice and level, we'll tighten the boom clamp down just a bit. As you can see, the front end of the new Q45 has a nice smooth feel. This is due to the slight bit of resistance that the Viscoset headset provides. It's a great upgrade. But in order to complete assembly, I'm going to move the stand to the front wheel, make everything nice and secure. The next step we're going to proceed with is attaching the brake cables to the brake levers. We're going to locate the front cable. And again, we have the bolt that holds the cable, and then we have the bolts that hold the caliper to the fork that are not quite tight yet. We'll do that here in a minute. We're going to locate the left lever. The left lever is the front brake, the right lever is the rear brake. The first step is to locate the cable that goes down to the front wheel. And we're going to insert the cable into the lever like this. And we'll make sure that our adjustment slots line up. And we'll pull that cable into the lever. You may have to loosen the cable at the caliper slightly to do this. Now, once we have the cable installed and everything seated, we will take a 4mm Allen and we will put upward pressure on the lever arm of the caliper in order to center it. And then we will tighten down the mounting bolts with our 4mm, making sure they're nice and secure. Again, if you loosen the cable, use your 5mm Allen to resecure it. The leverage angles are very important here. If you are uncomfortable adjusting brakes to get the right amount of pull, I highly suggest once assembly is complete, having your brakes checked and adjusted at a local bike shop. We can do a quick double check by spinning the wheel, make sure the pads are not rubbing on the rotor. If the wheel spins nice and freely, we're good to go to the next step, attaching the rear brake cable to the right lever in the same fashion we did the front brake. Once we have that installed, we will again put pressure on the lever arm of the caliper in order to center the pads, usually making sure they're nice and tight. We'll automatically center the caliper. We'll tighten those down with a number 4 Allen. We will check all of our mounting bolts. If you had to loosen the cable in order to install it on the lever, you can retighten it here, and then check for free movement of the wheel in the caliper. I'll emphasize here again, if you are unfamiliar with setting up and adjusting disc brakes, I highly recommend having a local shop do a double check once the bike is complete. The next step, we're going to locate our rear derailleur. We're going to add a little bit of grease to the threads there, even though there's a little bit of Loctite on there. It's very important that this derailleur get installed on the dropout properly, making sure that the stop is up against the B-limit screw. We're going to go into a little bit finer detail of adjusting the derailleur in advance here in a minute. The derailleur is an NX 1x. Note the adjustment screws down here. They're a little hard to see, but they're underneath. The derailleur also has a cage lock button. These limit screws are going to be important here coming up soon. We have our cable entry point here, goes through the pulley, and then it goes through the back side, and there's a little hole there. And once the cable goes through that hole, it routes through to the pinch bolt. It's very important to familiarize yourself with this rear derailleur. Just hold it in your hand. Make sure you understand where the cable goes and how it routes. It's much easier to do this when it's off the bike. As you can see here, the little button will lock the cage, so it's extended. If you do this, be very careful because the spring is strong. If it snaps back onto your hands, it's gonna hurt. And make sure that everything is in place before installing on the bike. Using your 5mm Allen, attach the derailleur to the derailleur hanger. Now to thread the derailleur cable, we're going to go through the small hole on the right side of the pivot clamp. It acts as a cable guide. To do that, we'll have to pull the ferrule off, then thread the cable through. Be careful not to bend or bind the cable. Make sure it's routed on the inside of the handlebar, just like the brake cable. And don't forget to reattach the ferrule over the end of the cable, and then slide it all the way down and reattach it to the housing. Definitely don't want to leave that part off. The first end of the cable goes into the top cable stop on the fork. We're going to make sure our shifter is shifted all the way down. Make sure there's no shifting in the cable before we slide over the other small section of cable housing. And that's going to attach up into the lower cable stop on the fork and the other end into the derailleur. All right, let's go over the cable routing here. The cable goes inside through the hole. It's going to go around the pulley, as you can see here. And we're going to carefully pull this cable all the way in. And we're going to seat the housing into the cable stops. We always want to make sure we have not lost our cable stops. We're going to double check, make sure our cable is routed properly all the way up to the shifter. Make sure at some point the housing didn't get pulled out of the adjustment nut. Again, always make sure the shifter is all the way downshifted. Now we're going to pull the cage and we're going to lock the cage open because we have to route the cable from the other side. It's much easier to do with the cage locked. With our 4mm Allen, we are going to undo the cable lock nut here. We're not going to tighten the cable necessarily just yet, but loosening it a little makes it much easier to route the cable. It's important to note on the top of the nut is a groove. That's going to be what holds the cable when we finally lock the cable down. Okay, so let's route the cable through the back side of the derailleur. You see a little hole right there at the end of the groove. We're going to route the cable through the hole, and it will come out the other side right by that adjustment nut. Again, we want to make sure we have this fully inserted through and try not to kink the cable at any point along the way. Before we go any further, let's check our derailleur adjustment screws and make sure we're all good there. We have three things we need to check. The B-limit screw, which is the back one, and up underneath we have our end limit adjustment screws. The one on the left adjusts the lower cog the one on the right adjusts the upper cog. For this tool, I recommend a straight edge. We're also going to need our 3mm Allen in addition to the 4 we already are using. Again, we're going to make sure that we have not tightened our cable. We want it to be loose for this step. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to check our alignment of our derailleur jockey wheel with our small cog. As we can see here, we are not quite aligned with the smallest cog, so we're going to want to check that. We're also going to check our B-limit screw. So the two screws we're going to adjust here are the B-limit screw and then also the end-limit screws. Again, the end-limit screws are kind of hidden up underneath the derailleur. You can see them tucked right under here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to preset this B-limit screw. I adjust out to the point where the screw from the top of the head to where the screw enters the derailleur itself is approximately 15mm out. That should give you a good initial setup for this particular stock setup. So using our ruler here, we're going to measure approximately 15mm to the head of the screw, to the top. And that should give you a good initial setting for the B-limit screw, nice and easy. Next thing we need to do is align our jockey wheels and set our end limits. This is a very important setting. As we can see here, our derailleur is not aligned with the smallest cog, so we won't get a full shift on the cassette. So what we're going to do is use our 3mm Allen, and we're going to loosen the end limit screw if we need to bring that down, that end limit for the small cog, until it's lined up. Now conversely, if it's on the other side of the cassette, you don't want to overshift, so then in this case we would tighten the screw. But either way, we want that very first cog to line up perfectly with our jockey wheel to set our lower end limit. Everything is set off of this adjustment, so this is a very important one. Now on the other side, we're going to push the derailleur all the way over with the cage locked out to see how we line up with the largest cog. That's looking pretty good. Now what we don't want is to overshift. So what we want to do is the end limit bolt, which in this case is the outer 3mm bolt, holding the derailleur in the right position, we're going to tighten that bolt until it stops. If you tighten it too much, you won't be able to shift into the largest cog. So we want that derailleur to push all the way over, but we don't want it to go further than the largest cog. And that will prevent any overshifting into your spokes. Once we have set our end limits, we can tighten our screw that holds the cable. Again, it sits in the groove in the washer. Make sure everything is downshifted again, and set our cable in the groove and use our 4mm Allen to tighten that bolt down. Use a pair of little cutters to cut that cable and attach the end cap. It's very important to attach this end cap. Just pinch it just slightly so it stays on. Otherwise your cable will fray. Now we'll locate our chain. Our chain should be in there with a quick link. We're going to remove the quick link from the chain first. Make sure we keep these in a nice, safe place. We're going to drape our chain over the chain ring. Now note, the chain ring is a narrow, wide style, meaning that the teeth are wide and narrow, so the chain only fits on the ring one way. We want to make sure that the chain is sitting on the ring properly. Once we have that, we're going to set the back side of the chain over the smallest cog. with our cage locked out, we're going to drop it over the first jockey wheel, and then we're going to go around the bottom jockey wheel. We want to make sure we miss the chain keeper in the cage right here. We don't want the chain going over that cage. So again, this chain just drops straight in right over the first jockey wheel, in between the stopper and the wheel, which also has narrow wide teeth, so pay attention to that. And then under the back side, that will give us our proper chain routing once we attach the chain and loosen the cage. We will add our quick link back onto the chain. Now sometimes you might be able to pull this closed. Sometimes these quick links are a little stiffer than that, so if it won't immediately go all the way tight, if you can't pull it tight, don't fret. Leave your cage gently closed. We're going to very carefully backpedal the chain. Might have to use our extra hand there to keep the chain on the chain ring, and we're going to route the quick link on the top. So the quick link is located on the drive side of the chain right there, and then we're just going to push forward on the crank, and once we push that forward, it will lock that chain link right into place. You can always do a double check of your shifting. You should have a nice horizontal chain line coming out of the small cog. That's that B-limit screw adjustment. Double check our alignment here. As we can see, our chain is nice and straight coming out of that cassette and into that first jockey wheel. That's a good alignment right there. Next, let's locate our pedals. I'm going to add a little grease to the threads here. Always a good idea, especially on pedals. As you'll notice on the inside, they're labeled. One is left, one is right. And we can see there's an R and an L. The R and the L go for the right side as if you were sitting on the bike. So we're going to take our pedals there, right and left. Again, in this case, the right side is the side as if you were sitting on the bike. If you have a pedal wrench like this, you're going to use that to tighten the pedals down. Now, if you don't have a pedal wrench, then you're going to want to use a thin crescent wrench, as these pedals don't have Allen holes on the inside. So we're going to use our thin crescent wrench to tighten both of the pedals down. Just give them a nice snug. You don't have to make them super tight. Just give them a good snug. Our seat quick releases, we're going to take these springs off. You can leave them on. I personally prefer to take the springs off. Makes it a little easier to get the brackets on and off. Now we're going to locate our seat back, the bracket, and one of our quick release skewers. And we're going to attach it to the seat posts. I recommend going in the second hole or third from the back. This is going to be what allows you to adjust your seat up and down, or the back steeper or at a shallower angle. Now, before we put anything else on, again, we're going to check some alignment. So we want to make sure that this is as even on a sight line with the lower seat brackets as we can, and that's accomplished by loosening the quick release on the seat tube and then just rotating that a little bit. Once we have that seat back on, we're going to take our other skewers and insert them into the 3 remaining holes, 2 on the frame, 1 on the seat back lever. we'll put the end caps on. We won't tighten them very far because we're going to need them to be a little loose. And once we've accomplished that, we want to locate our seat hardware. And on that, also our back bracket. This is the one with the angle on it. And we're going to attach that using our M5 hardware to the lower holes. We want to use the lower holes in this case for this model. So once we have those on there, we'll use our 3mm and our 8mm nut driver with our little adapter. Here we have our 8mm nut driver. This is in your Cruzbike toolkit, and the little socket adapter here. And with those inserted into there, we will be able to tighten that seat back hardware. Again, note the lower holes are the holes we want for that bracket. Now we'll find our lower seat brackets. In your package you have the stock medium and short bracket. Also in the package you have a spare second short bracket. So between those you have some combinations of seat angle we can do. We're going to locate the rest of our seat mounting hardware here. Should be all M6 hardware. I'm going to be using the two short brackets. I want to demonstrate here which mounting positions you can use on this particular Q45. The seat base is aluminum. It has two stock positions. You can always drill other holes if you want. But as we can see here, if we look down and line up those holes, we have two positions. We have a forward position and a rear position where the holes line up perfectly. Using different length seat brackets will cause you to need to use different holes on the seat. And before we attach this, we're going to take the seat clamp. We're going to rotate it around. We want that clamp to be with the smooth side to the top. That will give us the most room for our seat, particularly when using the short bracket in the back. So for this mounting, I'm going to mount it to the second hole and the middle hole, since I'm using the two short brackets. This is a stock position that I recommend you start with as you get used to the bike. Again, if we change to a different bracket size and line it up, we might end up using the more rear holes in the middle hole. That'll give you a more forward seating position. If you're a shorter rider, this might be the position you want to use. Or if you want the seat to have more recline, you'll want to sit this base in the forwardmost position. Once you have decided what position you want to use for your seat, we want to put our little rubber spacers on. Kind of decide, that'll give a little dampening there from the road. I like to insert the screws through the seat and then use the rubber gasket to kind of hold the screws in place. And then we will use our handy 4mm Allen and our nut driver once again to attach the hardware to the seat bottom. Those nuts should tighten all the way through just to grab the nylon. Once we have those brackets on the seat base, it should go right on to the seat mounts on the frame. And then we'll make sure we want to tighten those quick release skewers all the way, making sure that the nuts are seated down into the bracket themselves. Now that we have our seat base installed, let's get our remaining hardware, which should be 2 M6 bolts, 2 little rubber washers, and some nuts. We'll insert those nuts through the bottom of the seat back. Use the little rubber washers to keep them on there. And we will insert the seat back into the seat base, adjust our seat back, which should go right on, and then use our nut driver and our Allen to tighten the bolts. We just want to tighten them till the screws are flush. We don't have to over tighten and crush those little rubber washers. If you plan on adding fenders at some point, the very small fender mounting bracket comes in handy. That's what you will mount the fender to at the front end of the rear wheel. Using 2 M5 bolts, that bracket simply threads to the inside of the eyelets, right there. I personally don't run fenders, and so I leave it off, but if you plan on running fenders, this is the perfect way to attach the fender to the bike. Going to find our seat pad and our 4 strips of Velcro. 2 strips of Velcro will go on the base and 2 on the back. Simply put them in the same position as the Velcro on the seat pad. Make sure everything's nice and stuck down under the seat. And you have mounted your seat pad. And congratulations, your Q45 is basically 100% complete. The bike will stand great on a kickstand. Of course, the best way for the weight of the front end on the kickstand is to rotate it all the way around to the non-kickstand side. I'm going to take this bike, air up the tires, and then return, and we'll go over a preliminary fit before your first test ride. Now, in order to do a fitting, you're going to want a 4mm Allen and a 5mm Allen, and you're also going to want the other 5mm Allen that we are using before. So to get a good initial fit, we're going to have a seat on the bike. We're going to settle in. Everything is a little loose on the bike. We haven't tightened everything completely tight yet, but we're going to check our pedal distance, where we want, at the full extension of the cranks, a slight bend in our knee. So if we have to make an adjustment, we're going to use our 5mm Allen. Slightly loosen that boom clamp. We're going to also loosen our quick release skewer, and we're going to move that boom out just enough, a little bit at a time, using our indicators to keep track. Tighten that quick release, and then we're just going to test our fit. What we want is a slight bend at our knee at full extension. You should just be able to have the heel on the pedal at full extension, but you're not hyperextending your leg. The same is true on the back side of the pedal stroke. We want to have distance from our legs to the handlebar. So we're going to tighten that boom clamp again. We're going to use this wall or a friend to hold you up as a guide, because we want to check our distance from the handlebars. So not only do we want our legs with the right extension, we don't want to bump into the handlebar. So we want to have a good inch or so of room between the top of our leg and the handlebar. So in my case, I can go a little further. So I'm going to move the handlebars in. I'm going to loosen that boom clamp, and our pivot clamp is still a little loose, so I can pivot this handlebar in. I'm going to go 2 or 3 or 4 notches towards the cranks, making sure I did not move the bottom bracket distance. And again, I'll make sure my handlebars are level, tighten that boom clamp, make sure everything's level here. And I can tighten down that boom clamp. And then I can use the 5mm Allens. It'll take both of your 5mm Allens to tighten that pivot clamp. We want to make sure that's nice and snug. Now, if we need to make adjustment to our handlebars, we can loosen those clamps with a 4mm Allen. We can check our pivot. What we want is to have a nice natural bend to our wrists. We should have a good slight bend to our arms. We don't want to have our arms up like this. That'll be bad on our wrists. Same thing, we don't want it way down like this, because then the bars will be in our laps and our elbows will be behind our body. So somewhere where your elbows are aligned with your body and your wrists feel natural, you're going to be your best starting position for the handlebars. Again, we'll tighten these with a 4mm Allen. Again, make sure that there is an even gap on the top and the bottom. And also, again, make sure we retighten and check our chainstay clamps. Again, with an even gap, and these only need to be about a 1/4 turn past snug. If these get over tightened too much, they will break. So once they're snug, go a 1/4 turn past. Make sure your quick release, chainstay clamp, boom clamp, pivot clamp, bolt, and handlebar clamps are nice and secure. Tires are pumped, and once that's done, you are ready for your first test ride. And there you go. Congratulations on building your own Cruzbike Q45. Happy riding, and we are always here for help. Support at cruzbike.com.